It started out as any ordinary night at the diner. I had been working the evening shift at Rosie's for over a year, and I was used to the usual crowd. Locals grabbing a late meal, truckers stopping for coffee, families unwinding after a long day. But then, he walked in. At first, he seemed harmless, just another customer taking a seat at the counter. He ordered coffee and a slice of pie, nodding politely when I served him. He was in his late 30s, unremarkable in appearance. Just an average guy in a baseball cap and a worn jacket. But he kept coming back, night after night, becoming a regular. He always sat in the same spot, always ordered the same thing. I figured he must just enjoy my service or the food, but it was hard to ignore the little things that began to surface. Over time, his questions started to shift from casual small talk to something more personal. He would ask about my family, my plans, what I did outside of work. At first, I thought he was just trying to be friendly, but the questions grew increasingly intrusive. He asked about my favorite places to eat, how I spent my weekends, and whether I lived alone. Each inquiry felt like a little poke at my personal life, something that left me feeling exposed, yet I brushed it off as harmless curiosity. As the weeks rolled by, I noticed he began to linger longer after closing. It was just me and him in the diner, the lights dimmed and the jukebox humming softly in the background. He would sit, sipping his coffee and watching me clean up, making me acutely aware of his gaze. It felt uncomfortable at times, but I convinced myself he was just a night owl who enjoyed the atmosphere. But the way he looked at me became increasingly unsettling. I caught him staring when he thought I wasn't paying attention, his gaze lingering a little too long. There were nights when I could sense him following me as I left the diner, but he never came close enough to confront me. Instead, he'd keep his distance, watching from the shadows of the parking lot. I'd quicken my pace, heart pounding, trying to shake the feeling that I was being hunted. One night, after an unusually long shift, I found him waiting for me just outside the diner. He wore that same casual expression, but something in his eyes was different, as if he was studying my every move. I decided to take a different route home, weaving through the back streets, thinking it would throw him off. He didn't follow me all the way, but I caught glimpses of him in my peripheral vision. Always just a little too close. The sense of dread crept in gradually, but by the time I realized how deeply unsettling it all was, I felt trapped. It wasn't just the way he watched me, it was the way he made me feel, vulnerable and exposed, like I was a character in a story he was writing. He started to invade my thoughts, and I began to anticipate his presence, which twisted my mind into knots of anxiety. Things escalated one night when I discovered a small slip of paper tucked under my car windshield. It was a note, poorly scrawled, with just a few words about how he hoped I was having a good day. I felt a rush of nausea wash over me. Had he been waiting for me to leave? It was the first solid indication that he was crossing a line, that this was no longer just a casual diner relationship. I confided in a couple of my coworkers, but their reassurances fell flat. They said he was harmless, just a regular guy. I wanted to believe that, but every fiber of my being screamed otherwise. I started to feel paranoid, constantly checking over my shoulder as I walked home, bolting my door as soon as I was inside. I avoided being alone in the diner, tried to stay busy and surrounded by other staff members when he was there. But it was a losing battle. The last straw came on a night I'll never forget. I had closed up the diner and was preparing to leave when I heard a rustling sound from behind the counter. My heart raced as I peered around the edge, and to my horror, I found him crouched there. He didn't even seem surprised to see me. It was as if he'd been waiting for this moment. My instincts kicked in, and I scrambled for the back door, slamming it shut behind me and bolting into the night. I couldn't go home that night. I drove around aimlessly, trying to calm my racing heart. But the reality of what had just happened sank in like lead. I knew I couldn't just let this go. I had to do something. When I finally made it home, I called the police and explained everything, recounting every detail, every encounter. They assured me they would investigate. In the following days, he never showed up again. It was like he vanished into thin air. The diner was quieter without him, but I started to slowly feel relaxed again. I still watched for him, wondering if he would return, but there was no sign of him. This happened last week, and I still can't shake it. I go to the same supermarket near my apartment, late in the evening, when it's quieter. That night I walked in, ready to grab a few things for dinner. At first, everything was normal. About halfway down the canned goods aisle, I noticed him. Standing at the end of the aisle, he was looking in my direction. Tall, with unkempt hair and a gaunt face, his clothes hung off him like he'd put on someone else's too-big suit. I moved to the next aisle, hoping it was nothing. A moment later, there he was again, just a bit closer, his eyes fixed, just staring. I forced myself to stay calm, focusing on the shelves, pretending not to see him. But no matter where I went, he seemed to drift along behind me. When I picked up something, he would hover a few feet away, just watching. I could feel his eyes crawling over me. And every time I turned, he was just standing there like he'd been following me forever. He was quiet, never moving directly towards me, just watching. As I reached for a carton of milk, he slipped closer. He murmured something just under his breath, a question? And I ignored it, hoping he'd go away. But instead, he got bolder, inching nearer every few minutes, as if testing how close he could get. His eyes trailed over me, flickering with something eager. I started throwing random items in my cart, anything to get out faster. At the register, he loitered at the end of the aisle, still watching. I could feel him there, an unwelcome heat in his gaze, even as I tried to rush through the checkout. Every nerve was screaming, a rush of instincts taking over. I hurried out of the store, bag clutched tight, refusing to look back, trying to convince myself he was gone. But as I made it to my car, a shuffling sound caught my ear. I turned just enough to see him standing under one of the parking lot lights, his face partially shadowed. He started toward me, his steps oddly paced, like he wasn't sure how to walk normally. My heart leapt into my throat and I fumbled with my keys, practically throwing myself into the car. His footsteps picked up speed behind me. I managed to get the car started just as he reached the door, his hand grazing the handle as I pulled out of the space, tires screeching. Through the rearview mirror, I saw him standing there, just watching as I sped off. Ever since that night, I avoid that store, especially at night. A few friends and I thought it'd be fun to do a last-minute camping trip. We'd all been talking about getting out of the city for ages. So we found a quiet spot deep in the woods, set up our tents, and built a fire. As night settled in, we started telling ghost stories, letting the darkness close around us, our voices filling the quietness. At some point, faint rustling came from somewhere in the trees. It was soft, distant, and easy to laugh off as animals moving around. Every so often, a twig would snap or leaves would crunch just beyond the fire's glow. We joked about it, shoving each other's shoulders and making stupid jokes. It wasn't enough to break up our little circle around the fire, though the laughter grew a bit more tense. Whatever it was, it didn't seem close enough to be a problem. Eventually, we called it a night, stifling the last laughs as we climbed into our tents. It was pitch dark except for the moonlight slanting through the branches above. Just as I was about to doze off, I heard soft footsteps circling around our tents, followed by the subtle scrape of fabric shifting. A low, crunching sound came next, like someone rifling through the bags we'd left just outside. The others must have noticed it too, because everything got silent, like we were all holding our breath at the same time. The quiet made every little sound seem louder. Something heavy hit the ground near us, and then there was a slow, steady tug on the zipper of one of the tents. It felt like time stretched out, the dragging sound of the zipper clicking inch by inch, whoever or whatever it was outside carefully testing each tent's entry point. I could hear faint breathing, almost matched to the pace of the zipper's motion. It was like someone was savoring each tiny sound they made. Finally, one of my friends, realizing what was happening, let out a loud shout. Everything went silent. We could hear rapid footsteps retreating, twigs snapping sharply as the intruder bolted away. None of us slept after that, staying still and waiting until the first glimmers of dawn started cutting through the trees. When morning came, we all packed up as fast as we could, ready to leave. But as we started heading down the trail, every so often, we'd hear branches moving or leaves crunching, following us like something in the woods was keeping pace with us, hidden from view but close enough that it made my skin crawl. No matter how far we walked, the sounds didn't fade. Even back in the car, as we drove out of the forest, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone step out from the tree line watching us leave. I'd planned this vacation for months, just a week away to relax and unwind on the coast. I'd been looking forward to the quiet, exploring the local beaches, and just reading by the pool. The hotel was small, clean, and located right along the waterfront, perfect for the kind of trip I'd hoped for. For the first day, everything went perfectly. On my second day, as I sat alone by the pool, a man approached. He was polite, friendly even, striking up casual conversation about how he was also traveling alone. We chatted briefly, and he offered to buy me a drink. I declined, a little caught off guard by his eagerness, but he didn't push it. Over the next hour, though, he kept glancing over at me from the bar, almost as if waiting for an invitation to join. I brushed it off. People make friends on trips all the time, right? But as the days went on, he started appearing wherever I was. I'd spot him just a table or two away at breakfast, nodding to himself if I caught his eye, as if he was there by coincidence. Whenever I left the hotel to go for a walk or to grab lunch in town, he'd appear along my route too. He would approach, making up a reason to be there, claiming he'd gotten lost or that he was just exploring like I was. His smile seemed a little too fixed, too intent, each conversation inching closer, his eyes tracing my every move with a kind of fervor that made my skin crawl. By the third day, I'd begun changing my plans just to avoid him. That night, I thought I'd be safe in the hotel lounge. It was late, and I'd found a quiet corner to sip a glass of wine. But a moment later, I felt a presence at the edge of my table. I looked up, and there he was, smiling, his gaze almost predatory now. He tried to offer me a drink again, but this time his voice had an edge to it, something that didn't quite match his earlier friendliness. I declined and got up to leave, doing my best to stay calm. He didn't follow me at first, but as I walked through the lobby, I could sense his eyes following my every step as though calculating something. Feeling desperate for some distance, I decided to head out to the beach for a quick grounding walk under the stars. The hotel had a private boardwalk leading down to the shore, which was usually empty at that hour. But halfway down the path, I spotted movement. I turned, and there he was, standing just behind me, as if he'd been waiting for me to leave. I quickened my pace back toward the hotel, and that's when he started following more closely, his steps closing the gap between us. He didn't call out, didn't make a sound other than his footsteps, just followed. I kept my head forward, pretending not to notice, but my heart was hammering. I could feel him getting closer. As I reached the lobby entrance, I practically sprinted to the elevator, the doors opening just as he entered the lobby behind me. I hit the button for my floor, praying the doors would close before he could join me. I made it up to my room alone, but as I fumbled for my room key, I heard the stairwell door at the end of the hall creak open. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely get the door open. By the time I shut myself in, he was almost at my door. I heard the soft scrape of his fingers brushing against the handle, testing it, and then a light rattle as he pulled on it. I froze, hardly daring to breathe, waiting to see if he'd break the lock. After a few moments, the rattling stopped, but I couldn't tell if he'd left. Every little sound outside felt amplified, like he could be right on the other side, just listening. I finally worked up the nerve to call security. A few minutes later, they knocked on my door, telling me they'd checked the hallway, the stairs, the lounge, even the beach entrance, and no one was there. The next day, I stayed in my room, curtains drawn, heart racing at every small sound from the hall, or even the street below. Security checked in a few more times, but never found any sign of him. I decided to cut my trip short. As I packed my things, a feeling nagged at me, as if eyes were on me from somewhere unseen. When I finally made it out of the hotel, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't leaving alone. As I walked toward the train station, distant footsteps echoed on the stone streets behind me, like someone who wasn't quite ready to say goodbye. Even now, safe at home, I catch myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that creepy smile waiting for me. So a few weeks ago, I was sorting through some old stuff when I found a disposable camera I'd never developed. It must have been lying around for years. Out of curiosity, I decided to get the film processed, just to see what I'd captured. I didn't expect much, maybe some awkward photos from a party or blurry vacation shots. When I picked up the photos, the first few were exactly what I expected. Friends posing with ridiculous faces, a beach I'd visited a few years back, even a shot of my family dog, nostalgic stuff. But then, somewhere in the middle of the stack, things got strange. Photos of a random parking lot, empty alleyways, a nondescript hallway that didn't seem familiar at first, but as I looked closer, I realized it was the hallway of the apartment building I used to live in 2 years ago. My stomach started to turn as I went through the rest. A few of these shots were close-ups of windows, taken from the outside with curtains just slightly open. I recognized one of them as my old bedroom window, back from when I lived there alone. The next few were just as disturbing. The front of my old building, my mailbox, the door leading to my apartment. All these were taken at odd hours, some in the early evening, others in the dead of night. I felt queasy flipping through the last few photos. There were candid shots of me out and about, seemingly taken when I wasn't aware. Me sitting in my favorite cafe reading a book, walking back to my car after a night out, sitting alone on a park bench, headphones on, completely absorbed in my music. Each shot was close enough that whoever took them must have been nearby, watching carefully. The realization hit me in waves as I imagined someone silently following me, waiting for just the right moment to snap a shot without me noticing. I hadn't seen any of these photos being taken, hadn't even sensed anyone close. But the final photo in the stack made my stomach drop completely. It wasn't of me outside or back in my old apartment. It was my front door, my current front door, my new apartment, the one I'd moved into months ago, with the number and address clearly visible. Whoever had taken these photos knew exactly where I live now, and somehow I hadn't seen them. That night, I was too on edge to sleep. I checked every lock twice, turned on all the lights, and spent hours going over those photos, trying to figure out when they could have been taken. I went through my memories, the places I'd visited, people I'd met, trying to piece together any kind of hint that could explain it. Nothing made sense. No one I knew would do this. No one in my life even knew my last address except close friends and family. But these photos, they felt calculated. Each one taken from just far enough to stay hidden, but close enough to capture every detail of my day-to-day. The next morning, I opened my front door and froze. Sitting on the welcome mat was a single photo taken the day before of me inside my apartment, peering out from the very same door, probably around the time I was checking the locks. It was like someone was showing me they'd been just outside, watching, knowing I was feeling paranoid and feeding off it. My skin crawled. Over the next week, every morning, there'd be a new photo waiting for me. Each one was a candid, showing me somewhere I'd been the day before. At first, they were from more public places, me in the grocery store getting coffee. But as the days passed, the photos started getting more personal. One was from a bookstore I'd gone to alone, one where I'd spent nearly an hour in the far corner thinking I was alone. Another showed me at the laundromat late at night, headphones on, folding clothes, completely unaware of anyone near. I tried reporting it, but the police did nothing to help. They suggested maybe it was a prank, someone who'd gotten a hold of the camera by mistake. That was easy for them to say. They weren't the ones waking up each morning to a picture-perfect account of their own movements. It got to the point where I barely left the house. I installed cameras, started coming and going only when I thought no one would be around, trying to throw off anyone who might be watching. But the photos kept coming. Every day, one would be slipped under my door. And then, 2 days ago, I found one that was taken directly through my living room window. It showed me sitting on the couch, completely oblivious. The angle made it clear they'd been just outside the glass, maybe even for hours. That's when I realized this person wasn't just following me. They'd gotten inside the locked fence around my apartment, had been close enough to see the expression on my face as I sat alone, thinking I was safe. I'm writing this now because the last photo I found, this morning, was taken from inside my apartment. It's a photo of my bedroom, my bed unmade, the pile of clothes I'd left in the corner, the book I'd left open on my nightstand. It had to have been taken last night while I was asleep in the next room, and now, every time I close my eyes, I feel that same prickling, that awareness that someone is nearby, just outside the frame of my vision, waiting to see what I'll do next. And the cameras I installed never picked anything up apart from going static just before a photo appears. I joined a running group a year ago, a casual bunch who met up every evening for a few miles around the neighborhood. It wasn't anything hardcore, just an excuse to get out, exercise, and socialize. We were regulars, all friendly and familiar with each other, keeping the vibe light, easygoing. One night, a new guy joined. He was quiet at first, didn't introduce himself, just nodded to everyone as he jogged along, keeping to the back of the group. Over the next few nights, he started running beside me, keeping pace and striking up occasional conversation. He seemed nice enough, friendly, but not too pushy. After a while, he began running beside me almost every evening. I thought it was a little odd that he didn't seem to mingle with the rest of the group, but I shrugged it off as him being shy or new. After a couple of weeks, I started to notice him around town more. At the grocery store, a table away when I went for coffee, and at the bus stop one morning. It was strange, but I brushed it off, thinking maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe we just had similar schedules. But then he'd bump into me so often that it felt staged, especially when he'd act surprised, almost overly excited to see me. When I'd ask how he knew where I was, he'd brush it off like it was pure chance. And reluctantly, I'd let it go. Eventually, he began suggesting that we meet up outside the running group. I always found excuses, politely declining, but his persistence grew. Each time he'd run into me, he'd bring it up, asking me out, asking for my number. I was careful never to give him too much information, but I could feel him getting closer, trying harder. He'd show up at the cafe I visited almost every morning, sitting a table away, ordering the same foods and drinks I would order on that morning, mimicking me. Then, one night after a run, he followed me a little too close to my place. I picked up the pace, and he matched it step for step until I finally ducked into a gas station, pretending I needed something. He waited outside, lingering just within sight until he finally turned and jogged away. The feeling stayed with me, his eyes fixed on me, every step synchronized with mine. It was chilling, and I getting scared of going outside. After that, I was always on edge. I'd spot him waiting for me on random street corners or in the parking lot of my gym, always with that look like he knew exactly where I'd be. The final straw came when he showed up at my apartment late at night, claiming he was just passing by. I didn't even open the door. I just watched from the peephole as he stood there waiting, maybe hoping I'd let him in. He didn't leave for almost an hour. After that, I knew I had to tell someone. The next evening, I told the group what had been happening. They were horrified, quick to act, and agreed that he'd no longer be welcome. He'd been running with us for over a month by then, but no one knew much about him. He was a stranger after all, someone who'd just slipped into our circle without question. We never saw him at our runs again, and I thought that was it, that maybe he'd taken the hint and would leave me alone. For a few weeks, life went back to normal. I stopped seeing him around town and felt like I could finally relax. But one night, coming back from the grocery store, I saw him standing on the sidewalk across the street from my building, just looking up at the windows as if he was trying to figure out which one was mine. I ducked down, clutching my bag, and hoped he hadn't seen me. After that, he began showing up again, always on the edges of my routine, never close enough to speak or approach, but close enough to be noticed. He'd be on the opposite side of the street when I went for a morning coffee, just watching. One morning as I was going for coffee, there he was, across the road, waiting for me. I spotted a police car and waved them down. I told the officers what's been happening. But just before they could talk to him, he took off. The police chased after him down the road. I've not seen him since, and I want it to stay that way. This might sound ridiculous or like a half-baked creepypasta, but I don't care. I have to get it out, and honestly, I just need someone to tell me they've been through something like this. If anyone's experienced it, maybe they'll understand what happened, or at least help me find an explanation that doesn't leave me looking over my shoulder every night. So I moved into this little apartment about a year ago. It's nothing special, small, kind of drafty in the winter, but quiet and close to work. Honestly, I loved it at first. It was the right mix of affordable and safe, with just a few other units in the building and an old-fashioned charm I liked. There's only one big window in the living room that looks out across the street, which is usually quiet, especially at night. Everything was fine until I started noticing someone watching me from the building across the street. I can't pinpoint when it began exactly. One night, I was pulling the blinds shut and glanced over to see someone standing at the window directly across from mine. They were in shadow, so I couldn't make out any details, just a shape, standing perfectly still, facing my direction. At first, I tried to brush it off. People stare out windows all the time, right? Maybe they were watching something behind me or just zoning out. I closed my blinds and tried not to think about it. But the next night, and the next, the figure was there again, at the same window, standing in the same place, always facing my apartment. I don't know how to describe the way that sight sat with me. It was like having this itch I couldn't scratch or a chill that wouldn't go away. I kept the blinds closed after that, but it didn't make a difference. Every evening, I'd see that dark outline through the narrow slats, like a silent reminder that I was never truly alone. It didn't take long before things started getting worse. One evening, after a long day at work, I came home to find a piece of paper taped to my front door. The handwriting was jagged, almost frantic, and it simply read, "Open your blinds." My stomach twisted. I took it down immediately, my mind racing with questions. I didn't recognize the handwriting, and none of my neighbors seemed the type to pull a prank like that. I tried to shake it off as a coincidence, just some jerk playing a prank. But that night, I couldn't bring myself to sleep. Every little sound in my apartment felt amplified, and I found myself hyper-aware of the person across the street. Despite the blinds being closed, I felt exposed, like the figure could still see me, even though there was no logical way for that to be true. Then, it started escalating. Small, seemingly random things would appear on my doorstep. An apple, a faded photograph of a lake, a broken wristwatch. No notes, no signatures, just these items placed right outside my door. Each time I'd throw them away, hoping that ignoring it would somehow make it stop. But every day the strange gifts would return, each one more bizarre than the last. One night I thought I saw movement through my window blinds. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that I was being paranoid. But when I peeked through the slats, there was that same figure, perfectly still, facing me. I was growing more paranoid with each passing day. I'd take the long way home from work, double-check that my doors were locked, even started sleeping in the back room just to be farther from the living room window. But somehow, no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I reported it to the building manager and even the police, but it felt like no one believed me. There was nothing they could really do without more evidence. Then one night, after weeks of anxiety and constant vigilance, I decided to confront my fear head-on. I turned all the lights off in my apartment and opened the blinds, staring directly across the street. The figure was there. They seemed to shift, leaning slightly forward, as if acknowledging me. I don't know how long we stayed like that, me standing in the dark, them staring back. But then, as if on cue, they disappeared into the shadows, leaving only the empty window behind. I moved out shortly after that night. It's been months since then, but even now, sometimes I catch myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see a figure standing at a window, watching me from across the street. Like all stories, it started on an ordinary night. I'd been out late with friends celebrating someone's promotion, so I ended up hailing a cab in the early hours, figuring it'd be easier than dealing with late-night trains. The driver was a man probably in his mid-50s, with graying hair and a face that seemed perpetually calm, even tired, almost as though nothing could surprise him. It felt safe enough, which was why what happened next hit me even harder. At first, he didn't speak at all, which was fine with me. I was tired and just wanted to get home. But as we merged onto a quieter street, he started asking questions. They began with the typical small talk, where I was from, if I'd been in the city long. I gave vague answers, figuring he was just making conversation to keep himself awake. But gradually, his questions became strangely specific, in ways that left me unsettled. He asked about my routine. Did I always take cabs home at this time? Where exactly did I live, and if I worked nights? The shift in tone was barely perceptible at first, but I could sense it moving from casual conversation to something more probing, almost investigative. The worst part was how he framed it all so casually, as if I should answer without hesitation. I started giving shorter responses, hoping he'd take the hint, but he didn't seem to notice. He only grew quieter, watching me through the rearview mirror. Then, as we approached a part of the city I didn't recognize, he took an unexpected turn. I glanced out the window, disoriented by the sudden change in direction. The streets were empty, all buildings dark and shut for the night. We were in an industrial area, full of warehouses and no signs of life. I remember a low hum from streetlights, the kind of noise you can only hear in complete silence. I tried to stay calm, telling myself that he'd simply taken a shortcut, but every nerve in my body was screaming that this wasn't right. My pulse sped up, and I fidgeted with my phone, unsure of whether to call someone. But in that moment, he stopped the car abruptly, in a narrow alley that seemed to have no exit, no way for me to escape. He stayed silent, just gripping the wheel with an intensity that put me on edge. I could see the tension in his shoulders, as though he were making some internal calculation. There was no longer any pretense of small talk. I knew I needed to do something fast. In a burst of desperation, I grabbed my phone and began calling my friend, forcing my voice to sound casual but loud, mentioning my exact location and giving a description of the cab. I watched him through the rearview mirror, seeing how his expression changed as he realized I wasn't just sitting there passively. His grip on the steering wheel tightened for a moment before his hands loosened, and after what felt like an eternity, he released the door locks. As soon as I heard that click, I grabbed my bag and got out, never looking back. I walked to the nearest well-lit area, my entire body on high alert, heart hammering as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. I kept walking until I found a 24-hour diner, sitting there until my friend could pick me up. I remember thinking about the cab number, the driver's face, replaying the scene in my head over and over, trying to convince myself it was just paranoia, that he'd simply been an overly talkative driver who got lost. The next day, I decided to call the cab company just to report what had happened so maybe someone could look into it. I wasn't expecting much to come of it, but I needed some form of closure. But when I called and described the cab number and the driver, the representative sounded confused. She told me they had no record of a cab matching my description being dispatched that night. I tried to press for details, but they assured me that all their cars were accounted for. It felt like the ground dropped from under me. If it wasn't one of their cars, then who had picked me up? That night, I couldn't sleep. Every noise outside, every car that passed by made me tense up, half expecting to see that same cab parked outside my window, the driver waiting. Days passed, and slowly I started to push the experience to the back of my mind, convincing myself that it had just been an unsettling coincidence, a one-off incident. But about a week later, I found something on my doorstep. It was an unmarked envelope, taped carefully to the door. Inside was a single small note, written in the same kind of casual handwriting you'd use to jot down a grocery list. It simply said, "Miss our little chat." I moved shortly afterward, leaving that part of the city entirely.